Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development Crop Talk. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the June 24th edition of Crop Talk. And for today, we're going to go through a little bit longer of an update. I was been on the road quite a bit the last little while and seeing different things happening in the field. So I thought I'd give a general update of how the crop is progressing, at least in the Southwest. But I tried to get as much information from for the whole province as I could. Then we're going to hit to the crop scouting panel. We've got several real interesting questions that have come in this past week, and it'll be good to hear the panel discuss it and give us the answers. So we'll start off with the update, and strong winds from the past while have delayed herbicide application on a lot of the crops, and we're getting questions regarding staging and use of different products, but the last couple of days have been really good spraying conditions. The wind has been down, and producers have been able to get a lot of spraying done and are catching up fairly fast here. So I think a lot of the issues that we were facing for kind of last week with the wind are kind of going by us right now, and I think producers are catching up fairly fast. Warm conditions that are being forecasted over the next few days is definitely going to bring the crop on, and that's one thing that we need to be aware of when we're out there spraying. When you look at the seeding progress for the province right now, we're pegged at 100%, which is pretty accurate. There are still a few areas that guys weren't able to get on some of the wetter land that are still looking at something to do with that land. I was at a producer's place yesterday that finally got some fields sprayed with Roundup, and they're talking about sowing to green feed, either a millet or an oats crop. And their biggest one is they don't have cattle, but they're thinking of using up some of that moisture by planting into some of those stands. So go into a little bit of some of the crops that I've been seeing over the last little while here. Fall rye is heading out and flowering. Winter wheat just starting to head out and close to being ready for fungicide application. So I think with that, I think producers are going to really need to keep an eye on it. There was a field yesterday or during the weekend, I guess, where I took the picture at the bottom. The screen there on the right hand side, and you could see where some of the heads, this was in a wheel track, and so it's actually heading out a little bit faster than the rest of the field. But one of the cautions I always tell producers is when you're watching for that fusarium time period, if warmer conditions come on, make sure you're keeping an eye on them, because sometimes those plants tend to come out and flower very fast. So keep an eye on the winter wheat if you've got it, and make sure your timing is going to be close to the right time for application. With that, I'll show the fusarium head blight map, and when you look at it right now, we're in anywhere between that low to moderate risk area for the whole province. Southeastern part of the province has been getting rains pretty much on a daily basis, pretty much, you hear, and so they're definitely a lot wetter down in there. And I would say in that area that they're, as the map is showing, they're in a high risk area right now. These maps are continually being updated, so definitely be checking with them. Every area is going to be a little bit different depending on spotty showers, depending on humidity, factors that affect fusarium. So definitely be keeping an eye on it. Right now, we're more concerned about the winter wheat crop. Most of the cereal crop, and I'll be talking about that in a bit here, but most of the cereal crop is still not in the stage where we need to be too concerned about it. Rainfall over the last 7 days up until the 21st. You look at a stretch that went through the southwest and the northwest part of the province where we got anywhere from 10 to 20 mils. The majority of the province, again, didn't receive a lot. And then the southeast corner that seems to be getting showers on a regular basis. There definitely is some dry areas throughout and when you look at these areas right here to the north, there's areas that are fairly dry. Yesterday I was down into the Cromer area down close to the Saskatchewan border, and there was some dry areas through there as well. And looking like rainfall over the next little while in general is going to be needed for most of the province, probably except for the southeast part. Here's the weather map for the next 7 days. So from the 22nd, so from Monday till the following Monday, the 29th. And you look at Manitoba, and we're kind of in an area where they are forecasting some rains, anywhere from, a half to, maybe up to that inch of rainfall. And it seems to be general throughout the whole province. So it'll be interesting to see if that actually comes through. It would be great timing as producers are getting caught up with spraying. And yesterday I was seeing some producers out there starting to cut hay. So I think we're probably due for a rainfall anytime now. And then when you, I think I showed this one here, so I'll just go to the soil moisture. Right now, when you look at our soil moisture, pretty much throughout the province, we're anywhere from optimum to wet. And I know in some areas it doesn't seem like that, but when you do dig down, and this goes down to 120 centimeters, so it does go down fairly deep, there is some moisture down there. And I know yesterday, even digging down in some of those fields, we were definitely finding moisture in a lot of areas. So moisture's there. I think the root systems need to get down to it to get in some places, and I think that'll happen over a short period of time. Looking at our cereal crops, I think right now they're in several stages out there. There is some later seeded stuff that's only in the 2 to 3 leaf stage. But I think in general, the cereal crops look pretty good. Most are tillering, and some of the earlier crops, some of the early barley I was seeing not far from the flag leaf stage. And a few of the wheat fields also that we're sowing early are getting close to that flag leaf stage. So we're definitely, with this heat we might be looking at over the next little while here, we might see some of these crops catch up fairly fast here. At this time, disease levels look fairly low in the fields. Doesn't mean it's going to stay the same, but right now, leaves pretty much right down to the bottom of the canopy look fairly well. So that's good news for fungicide application and timing, and maybe we could get away with maybe just getting close to the fusarium time period where we need to be watching, especially for the wheat crops. Canola, there's a crop that right now is in a lot of different stages, but in general, most fields are looking good, even the later seeded stuff. Later seeded stuff went into some fairly warm soil and some moist soil and came up pretty fast. So it's now kind of a release stage. But the earlier seeded fields are starting to cabbage out, and some of them, like this one I was in yesterday, was pretty much in the pre-bolting stage. So you're not too long for this stuff starts to bolt. So I was still in yesterday morning, was in a field where a guy had to spray for flea beetles still. So the flea beetles are still active with some of those later seeded crops, and I think producers still need to keep an eye on it. They're still doing their herbicide application on those fields, so it still gives you an opportunity to add in some insecticide if the flea beetles are doing damage. Cutworms, I'm seeing some cutworms, but they're pretty much over for this year. They're getting to the stage where they're going to be done their cycle, and so I think that's a good thing, at least for the ones that are affecting the canola right now. peas. Peas are looking good. They're sowing early. They were sowing into moisture. They can handle the cooler temperatures, and they just seem to keep going on here. And a lot of the fields are starting to cover the ground. We're seeing some real early fields that are going to start flowering here anytime. We are seeing some environmental issues, mainly because the plants are growing so fast that they are pretty tender. And when you look at the top right-hand picture there, just some environmental stress showing up on some of the plants. So again, just a factor of the plants growing so fast and being and developing. And so I think they're in a stage now where we're going to be seeing some fungicide being applied and getting ready for going into the flowering stage. Soybeans, crop on average anywhere from the first to second trifoliate. We're seeing some later seed of crop in the unifoliate stage still. Wind and the cool temperatures. I've seen several fields where just the wind and more wind damage than anything. And it's had a real effect on some of the soybeans. We're seeing some real tattered leaves, some leaves that just didn't get the opportunity to develop under good conditions. So some of the crop is suffering a little bit, but in general, I think it's starting to take hold, and a lot of those crops are starting to bounce back right now. So I think in a week's time, it'll make a big difference for a lot of those crops as we go forward. Corn and sunflowers, probably two of the crops that are seeing the most impact of the cooler weather and just not developing as fast as we would normally like to see them develop. Corn right now, geez, I've seen it from just coming through the ground to probably the V5 stage, and that's not great for corn for this time of year. Needs to be growing fast, and hopefully this warm weather that we're going to get will help it go along. Sunflowers, same thing, the V3 to V5 stage. Again, just not the right weather for them to get going. When you look at our maps, you're seeing that most areas throughout the province are in the low 90s for the normal percentage for heat units. So again, just something that we just need a little bit more heat for those crops to come back and start taking off, and they will. As long as we get the heat, those crops tend to catch up fairly fast, and it wouldn't take long for us to see those crops back on the right track again. It's just that right now the cool nights haven't been helping them as well. So I think that's one of the things we need them to be growing 24 hours a day, and especially in some of the areas that are a little bit farther north, the guys have been trying to grow them, especially corn, to get it to mature. So with that, that's a bit of my update for today. I'm leaving a little bit more time for questions because we've got a few questions that are going to be take a bit of time here. So I think I'm going to go into the panel now. Like normal, we have all the panel members here today, and there's our information to contact us with questions, Lori Forbes and myself. So if you have questions, definitely feel free to send them on to us. Question number one goes to, I'm going to address this one to Dennis Lang. Some producers are getting ready to start spraying fungicide on peas for Bacterial Blight. What is the proper timing for application? What should you be looking for in scouting? And will a producer need to spray more than once? And are green peas more of an issue? So I think Dennis has prepared a couple slides to help answer this question. So Lori, let's maybe turn the screen over to Dennis.
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. Can you all see my screen right now?
You bet.
Okay. Bacterial Blight, this is kind of the perfect timing for it. We're just starting to see early flowers now in some areas. So this is the time to be scouting and looking for these purple flecks on the lower leaves of the canopy. Now, It is a fungal disease. It's part of the Ascochyta disease complex. So you can see these lesions either on the lower leaves, on the stems, if it's severe. They can be spread by rain splash. So if you're getting some wet conditions, you could see some spreading happening of that through the canopy. Again, typically from the bottom up is where you'd see a lot of the disease showing up, because typically what you will see is that's where the canopy is usually a little denser in the lower canopy versus upper. There's one slide I wanted to kind of throw up here. There's two photographs here. And the reason I throw these up is because you can have bacterial blight, especially with all the strong winds and rains and that type of thing that we've had that have beaten up the plants. And usually within 10 days, you start to see some lesions start to show up. And you can also have microsporial blight or a combination thereof in both of those. So how can you tell the difference? Well, when you look at bacterial blight, which is the image on the left, typically they're just lesions. They're kind of broken up by the veins, whereas the picture on the right is microsporial blight, and those lesions kind of go right across the vein. So that's one telltale sign. Symptoms with bacterial blight, typically you might see a bit of an ooze on the lesion itself. A few things to keep in mind. The lesions are more angular, and they again don't expand across the leaf veins. Fungicides are not effective against bacterial blight, so that's the reason why you may want to make that distinction between the two. You can, see bacterial blight as seed-borne or infected residue. So if your rotation is a little bit tighter, it is favored by cooler, wetter conditions as well, and spread by rain and wind splash. Whereas microsporial blight, those lesions expand across the leaf veins, as we saw in the image previously. They first appear as small purplish flecks. Some people call it purple freckles. When you start to see the early symptoms show up in the lower canopy, eventually those flecks enlarge and coalesce, and resulting in lower leaves becoming completely blighted. Fungicides are a good way to help control this disease. Again, using disease-free seed and watching rotation does help to some degree. As far as timing goes, early flowers. So if you're starting to see those flowers, now is the time to be starting to scout. Foliar fungicides work by protecting the healthy green plants, but they don't repair any damage. So you still want to see some disease present, just to show that there is, and maybe if you're starting to see some purple flecks in the lower leaves, that would be kind of one of the telltale signs to consider spraying. There are a number of different products found in the Manitoba Guide to Field Crop Protection. I've listed those here. Some of the products, I've listed the brand names, but some of the products are the same two products. It's just under different names sold by different companies. What works best for you is based on sometimes on your past history, what does work. The one thing I'll talk about a little bit later though in this grouping, it's talk about the different types of groups that we have with these products and the importance of changing groups. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. There is a nice tool that you can use though to help determine what your risk level is for microsporial blight. This was developed here by the University of Alberta, and it kind of gives you a kind of a walkthrough early detection risk assessment. So ideally, when we do this, when we walk it through, so if we hit the first here, so let's say we look at crop canopy, and right now let's say our crop canopy is moderate. We're going to give it a score of 10. We're going to add, the next one is leaf wetness at noon. If your plants are pretty wet at noon, you're either in the moderate or maybe even into the high range, but we're going to use moderate in this case. 5-day forecast, light showers, we'll say 10, and percent of plants showing symptoms. Again, this is where it's important to do some scouting, usually going out a couple times a week to see if there's any change in the disease progress. So that total then gives you 55. So by this particular score sheet, you'd be maybe best waiting a little bit before you do that application. The reason I kind of use this as a tool is because there are some instances, for example, in 2019, where it was fairly dry through this period. So it may allow you to wait a little bit before you do that first application, and then maybe that would be long enough for it to carry through until harvest. Because every field will get some level of microsporial blight in it, but the later it sets in, the less it affects yield. If it sets in early, it affects yield more. Typically, once you do that first application, then going in 10 to 14 days later, if there are some symptoms that are persisting, you want to go in. As far as the difference between different types of peas, I haven't seen that myself, if there's any difference in susceptibility between greens and yellows. I would more tend to look at, what your field history is like, also too what the weather conditions are like as well. If you've gotten some wet weather and canopy is always wet and you see symptoms in there, I would do that on a field by field basis and make that determination. Just a few of the points I've already mentioned here as well. The one thing I kind of wanted to mention here, and this kind of goes to the question about spraying twice, because some growers do look at spraying twice. So in North Dakota back in 2018, I believe, they've come across some issues here where they're not getting the control with the products that they're using, and they're finding that there's been some resistance issues starting to show up. So here on the left, you see our control here, lesions all the way up the stem. Headline in this particular case here showing that we're some disease still present, whereas a proline, different chemical group, we're seeing a bit better control. In the guide to crop protection, you can see here the different groups, and we'll just do that here. So here we're having we have a couple different groups to kind of look at here. I guess in this case here, where the fungicides are. Elatis and those products and Lance are up in this in group 7. The strobies are in group 11. So when you are rotating some of these different groups, just look at the products that you're using. So Priaxo is in this group 11 here, and so some folks might want to change over to Delero to use a different group in that respect. So again, scouting early. Going multiple times is a good way to determine if there's any disease present. Once you see those flecks and you got conditions that allow that disease development, i.e. the moisture that we're getting, then going ahead and spraying would be good timing on that. So you can see here the two groups. So that's all I had for slides. I haven't heard of any major reports yet, but I have heard of some growers starting to spray just because their fields are candidates for disease development. So.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. We're going to go on to the next question, and it's got to deal with peas as well, and this will be for John Gavloski, and kind of relates a bit to Dennis's question. Several producers are looking at spraying fungicide on peas. Is this the time to be watching for aphids, and what is the best way to scout and determine numbers? And is the timing, I guess, the same time good for spraying?
Yeah, so regarding timing of scouting, generally when about 50 to 75% of the plants have flowers, that's the ideal time to be scouting for aphids and peas. So the timing is very similar. Two ways you can do it. You can take a sweep net and do sweeps. If you're doing a set of 10, the threshold would be about 90 to 120 aphids in those 10 sweeps. Or you can take tips of plants, and I usually shake them over a tray or something to knock the aphids off. Just count the number in a handful and do the math, and it works out to about 2 to 3 aphids per plant tip on average for the threshold. And those thresholds relate to about a 5 to 6% yield loss. There's a table correlating numbers and sweeps and per plant tip on a fact sheet on our website if you're interested in that information. Now, regarding control, if you do need to control them, if you're above the threshold, the proper timing is when you start to see early pods. Really, the feeding to the flowering plants doesn't do much. It's the feeding at the plant tips when you have young pods developing. That's what does economical damage. So that's the ideal timing for spraying. One caution we have with aphids in general is spray if you need to. You're not doing yourself any favors by tank mixing something in if the population's not high. Aphids have an incredible reproductive potential, much more than most of their natural enemies. So there's this effect called rebounding, where if you spray a field that is being maintained by natural enemies below economic levels, you wipe out everything, you get a few aphids back in, they can often explode. So We do encourage people scout, see if you're above threshold, spray if you need to. If you don't need to, you're better off just leaving it alone.
Okay, thanks, John. Next question. This one is going to go to Tammy. I always like to try to stump Tammy and try to find something that's weird and going on out there. So found this in several sloughs and low spots yesterday in the southwest here. Was wanting to know what the weed was and does it need to be controlled, or seems I've never seen it take over sloughs like this one has.
Okay, so I don't know if anyone has seen, there's one weird commercial out there, I don't know, something about pickle or something, and they have this silly yellow flowered plant in there too, and it's the same one. Now, Lionel, you called it marsh fleabane, I think, but I know it more as like swamp ragwort. It's also called northern swamp groundsel, or mastodon flower, whatever. Anyway, range and pasture products are pretty much your only option there. The problem being that you're usually near water. So groundwater contamination is quite often happening when you use some of these products like Reclaim or Milestone or that sort of thing. So a real challenge as far as what to do with it. And the other problem with it is if you look at that seed or that flower, it sets a lot of seed, and then you have a seed bank for a very long time. So it can poison livestock. There's also some good news that you probably didn't want. So livestock does tend to avoid grazing it, which is probably smart on their part. That being said, apparently you can eat the young leaves. So maybe we should get busy eating it. So for that point, probably mowing it to prevent seed set if you can. If it is a dry area, try using a herbicide to control it, and again, prevent seed set, although in most cases it looks like we're a little bit late. Is it a noxious weed? Not that I'm aware of at this point in time, although I'll double check now that I've got 14 different names for it. But I don't recall it being on the Noxious Weeds Act, and I'll update you if I change my mind on that, okay?
Okay, I was the interesting point. I was talking to the farmer we were looking at his field, and I just noticed he had about 4 sloughs in the field, and it was just solid with this. And he said it only happened over the last 2 or 3 years when it got really wet there. He said after it started to dry up a little bit, some of those sloughs, and this weed has just taken over. He said it's just unreal.
Yeah, and that seed is long lasting. So when it has the conditions to flourish, it will. But it definitely likes to be wherever you see cattails or wherever you have some kind of a slough, that's where it will tend to be. And it looks like it's got perfect conditions this year where you took this picture anyway.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. This one could be for John Hurd, or I don't know if Dane is on today, but Dane actually took these pictures, or Anne, if she's on. Leaf burn from foliar applied herbicide. Why does it happen, and can it be avoided?
Okay. Well, thanks to Dane for taking this picture to try to stump me with it, because this is a topic that we have been trying to introduce farmers to, especially a year like this where we may need to use that option of split nitrogen in our cereal crops. You know, some nitrogen to start the crop, but then to come back. And we've had some very good research done in recent years showing that we had some, good yield increases by withholding about 1/3 of the nitrogen until, well, those stages you said you're seeing out in Western Manitoba, right from the tillering stage. At that point, we got 3 to 4 bushel yield increase by putting our nitrogen on there versus all up front. And we did not lose yield if we went all the way until the flag leaf stage. And both of those splits did improve protein over the all up front. So we had some pretty favorable data. Now, I guess the details are in the application. In our research, we were fortunate. We got rains within 5 days of application, so it got into the plant. And the other thing we were doing is using urea. So those pellets were applied, infiltrated the canopy, and we were not experiencing any of this leaf burn. Not many farmers have are not European wheat growers. Like European wheat growers have spin spreaders and they can apply nitrogen without injury in their crops. We have a limited number, so we resort often to using our sprayers and doing it. First thing is to swap out. We don't foliar apply when we're feeding the foliage. But even I've heard this year that people dribbling nitrogen have caused some tremendous scorch. If I was to try to suggest, ways to overcome that or reduce it, if we can dilute with water, that would be a good thing. Our farmers that look to manipulate protein with a much later application, they dilute 50% with water. They also apply in the evening when it's cool, and avoid wet foliage. If you put it on wet foliage, that tends to spread the pain. And so those streams are going to bounce off and hopefully hit the ground better if the foliage is dry. But a system.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you here, John. I'm going to take some credit too for herbicides. We can possibly have this leaf tip burn from some herbicides, especially on some nice hot, humid days where the herbicide gets sucked up into the plant really quickly, and the plant doesn't have enough time to metabolize it, and so we see some burn that can happen that way. So I know that this one was foliar nutrition, but if you've got a herbicide or lots of surfactant in your tank, you can end up with some of this type of scenario as well. We especially see it with oats on a nice hot humid day, and we talked about that I think last week in our crop pest update. The other thing that we've had a fair bit of is just surfactant burn in canola this year, with especially with Liberty, which has a really great surfactant in it, where we start to see some leaf spotting or some even bronzing, whatever you want to call it, and some other symptoms that are just meaning that the herbicide's working really well. And if you do foliar nutrition plus herbicide, you have an even greater opportunity for burn.
Yep. Very good. And the other compounding factor here is the winds that we've been having have been causing the plant to do a lot of extra transpiration. And I'm sure that the winds are contributing to the burn symptoms we're seeing. Put that, turn away from that ugly picture. Put another one up there, Lionel.
Okay, I just wanted to make one more comment with what Tammy had mentioned, and I had a producer that was adding it to his herbicide, and he actually made the field turn like a yellowish color, almost like he would light application of Liberty. The whole field was just a light yellow color, and so definitely had a lot of intake from the plants that day. Okay, here's a question that came in yesterday, and this one will be for John Gavlowski. The question says, as we grow malt barley and found thrips that currently are above threshold, when is the optimum time to spray, crop staging, and time of day? We generally try to avoid insecticides if at all possible, as we like to maintain the beneficial population. We also hope to avoid any unnecessary negative impacts on the environment. For pests that normally start on field edges, we would minimize damage to the environment and beneficials by spraying field edges only, if that is the worst effect. Unfortunately, the thrips are spread throughout the field, so that does not seem to be like an option. Is there a product there that is recommended for spraying?
Okay, a lot of good questions there. So the timing to be scouting for thrips is as soon as the flag leaves start coming out and continue scouting until the heads are up. Once the heads are fully up and emerged, there's been research to show that insecticide applications after that point really don't do much. So it's that flag leaf stage, early heading, where you're going to get economic returns from spraying economic populations. Now, what we consider economic, when you're scouting, look mainly at the upper two leaves. That's usually where you're going to find most of the barley thrips. Maybe peel them back a little bit, because sometimes underneath the sheath, and try to get some good estimation of numbers you're seeing per stem that you look at. The threshold information, there is good research, and what they figured out was you are losing about 0.4 bushels per acre per thrip per stem. So you can use that as a guideline, and knowing your chemical cost and the value of your barley, you can do the math and figure out whether it's going to be economical. There's a formula that we use instead of just giving people a number. What we suggest as a formula is the cost of your control divided by the expected dollar value per bushel, then you divide that by 0.4, and that's the formula that we use. Most times when people are doing that, it's in that 7 to 8 thrips range per stem, but again, it will vary depending on the value, if it's malt barley versus seed barley, etc. So you can use that 0.4 bushels per acre loss to kind of figure out the economics of it. Now, as far as controls go, unfortunately, the only thing registered for barley thrips is Saigon and Lagon. Systemic product, it'll do a good job on the thrips. It is not friendly on beneficials, though. It's a very broad spectrum product, so unfortunately, if you do spray for thrips, you probably are killing a lot of beneficials. Barley thrips can have very heavy edge effects at times, as was noted. So there are times when you can scout and maybe just get away with doing an edge spray. And we do encourage people to scout into the field just to assess that. But yeah, if you are needing to spray, if you're above threshold, Saigon or Lagon are your only options, unfortunately, and they're broad spectrum.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Question for either Dane or for Tammy. I think Tammy had talked a little bit about it, but got actually 2 calls, one yesterday regarding this, and then on the picture on the right-hand side was a picture text to me the other day, and they were seeing whitish type spotting on the leaves of the canola. So if either of you want to talk about that, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Lionel. I was able to jump on here, had some technical issues joining earlier. I believe Tammy did mention a number of root causes to spotting on canola leaves like this, particularly if it was a Liberty tolerant canola crop. We do tend to see this a little bit more there. There's a heavy surfactant load in Liberty herbicide, and coupled with environmental conditions or perhaps some nitrogen, liquid nitrogen residue in the tank, that can cause a window painting or white speckling of those canola leaves. If this is a concern for a grower, just look at the newest leaves, the new growth. Is it still present on that leaf or not? If not, it's very likely that it was just due to the time of application, environmental conditions, high sun, high surfactant load at that time, causing that window pane effect. Doesn't generally impact further than that, and there's likely to be no yield drag as a result.
You got it, Dane. I don't need to add anything.
Good, thanks, guys. One for Dennis Lang. Producer was looking out, he was looking at second application spraying, and he noticed some spotting on his soybean leaves. If you could mention what this might be.
Well, I see this every year. This is bacterial blight, and you can see here by these yellowish, by the yellowish rings on the screen here. With bacterial blight, typically when you start to see that show up in the plant canopy, is you start to see that in the kind of the upper canopy, and 10 to 14 days after kind of a wind event. Nothing to be too concerned about. Septoria, a brown spot, is something else that some folks might see, but you generally wouldn't see this yellowish ring around it. So being that it's a bacteria, really not much you can do about it. Best thing to do is let the plants grow out of it.
So normally plants will just outgrow it?
Typically, yes. It's the new leaves will be fine. It's just you just had some issues at the time when with all the winds and some areas had some hail and those types of heavy rains. You're going to see the plants get damaged, and bacterial blight just tends to show up about 10 to 14 days later. It's very common.
Okay. And what was the other one you said it sometimes gets confused with?
Well, the Septoria brown spot, but the main difference there is when you're looking at the plant itself, I always tend to look at where in the canopy it is. If it's in the upper canopy and you see these yellow rings, then that's when you're looking more at a bacterial. Whereas if it's in the lower canopy, the lower leaves, you don't see that yellowish ring around it. You'll see the kind of the brown spots. That's more Septoria brown spot. It is a fun. Septoria brown spot isn't typically something that we'd ever spray for. We do see it every year, but it's never been to a level where we've had to have any economic consequence. So.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. John, the producer sent me this picture, and I think we get this every year, but what's the red bug crawling around on the ground?
Okay, so these are called red velvet mites, and they're both a predator and a parasitoid, depending on time of year and what they're on. So they're beneficials. They're nothing you need to worry about. They really stand out, though, against black or brown soil, so they're easy to see. Later in the season, we often see them under the wings of grasshoppers. When they get on the grasshoppers, they act as a parasite, so they are feeding on the hemolymph or blood of the grasshopper. They generally don't kill them, but they can weaken them a little bit. So with a lot of grasshoppers around, we might see their populations of the mites doing quite well, but they will also eat eggs and very small insects as well. Again, they can be predaceous at times. And again, usually they're noticed more early in the season when they stand out against the soil.
Okay. John, did you have a couple slides that you wanted to show?
I do not, no.
No, I'm sorry, John Hurd.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, next slide is this one here, and there's a question that has come up here, a couple questions. First question is to Tammy. Can you repeat the names you called the weed that I showed you? So could you give the names that you had called this again, Tammy?
Yeah, Tammy's right here.
Oh, and John Hurd learned how to unmute himself. We're having a great day.
Now I just need to figure out how to mute Tammy.
Not possible when we're in the same room, which is, so marsh ragwort or swamp groundsel, like it has a whole bunch of common names. And unfortunately, I can't remember them all off the top of my head because I ran over here to see if I could help John Hurd unmute his microphone. So I'll go back to my room and maybe he'll share his slides and then I can give you all of the ones that I had, okay?
Yeah, the other one I had for it was marsh fleabane, I think.
Oh yeah, marsh fleabane. Yep, exactly.
And but yeah, no, okay. So John, if you are prepared, we can make your screen to you and you can show us some of your
He's
slides.
like a Boy Scout. He's prepared, Lionel. He just he'll present right away.
Okay.
Show your screen.
Yeah. Are we live here now?
Show
You bet,
your
John.
screen.
Okay. Good. So.
Okay, can you see his screen at the moment?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay.
Okay, so good. Just a bit of scouting doing yesterday, and I was in the area of the province where sometimes we do see copper deficiency, tending to be those sandy soils, low organic matter, high pH, and I don't know, it's not like being there, but if you look, you can see that some of those leaf tips are showing some of the typical pigtailing that we do see that's rather characteristic of copper deficiency. But again, it was not general. It was fairly slight within the field, something that, you know, when you look at it, say, now, is that copper or is that just some wind damage because of the high winds that we've been having? And I'm just using this as an example of really, when in doubt, if you don't have a history on that field and the symptoms are slight, I always take a tissue test. So make sure that you're prepared and ready, that when you see some of these things, it's always nice to have a firm diagnosis for the grower so that they can go back and intervene if necessary. So that was the one issue. And then the next slide here was actually in your area, Lionel, and we get questions about striped corn. And so we can go through all the fingers on our hands. Is it zinc or is it sulfur? Or if you get your answers from Google, you could also be confused into thinking it's magnesium, because it is magnesium in places with acid soil, or it could be manganese, or it could be iron in Colorado. But basically for us, usually it's either zinc or sulfur when you get that striping. Again, the remedies are completely different. And I generally, if I don't have the soil test background to back me up on that, will again take a tissue test at that stage. But again, last week we talked about purple corn. Striping is another symptom in corn. It could be a number of issues. And we really try to recommend people do the diagnostic approach of backing up your hunches with tissue and soil sampling.
Are you sure it's not herbicide again? Doesn't everyone blame herbicide?
Well, it probably is one of, yeah, I guess herbicides are stress. And if we have crop not growing well, it just does not metabolize as well. But my corn at home, I tend to make it look a lot worse than that with my herbicides.
No comment.
Okay. That's my sermon, Lionel. You can move on from me.
Okay, Lori, if you could give me the screen back. Well, John was doing his presentation. I got a really bad picture of a wheat plant. One of the questions that came in was if we could talk about leaf staging, and so I was in a rush trying to find a picture so we could talk a little bit about it, and just a way of go through the methods of determining a cereal leaf stage. So when you look at this plant here, you've got your first leaf, and I think that's what it's trying to say there. One of the things that the tricky things is always to not count the tillers, and when you're counting the leaf stage. So this is your first tiller right there. So you wouldn't count that as your. So there's your first leaf. There's your second leaf there, and there's your tiller that came out there. There's your third leaf right there, and then you got your fourth leaf there, and this one looks like it's the fifth leaf coming out. So this one here would have two tillers on it, and then this one on the side, I can't quite read what it's saying there, but that would be one that come from the crown, so it wouldn't be included in the leaf staging as you're going up the plant. It'd be basically another tiller. So that's the way I would interpret it. If you want to go to our crop guide, and you go into the crop guide, they also have a way of how to identify crop and weed leaf staging. So there's some good examples there as well. And I don't know if any of the panelists want to comment on it. Oh, Anne is on. I see. Anne, would you want to make any comments on that? I know the picture is lousy, but that's the quickest one I could find.
Sure. I was just, while you're talking, just quickly looking up some growth staging guides, and there are some really good ones out there. And it really just depends how, what you're looking for and what you want to stage. So is it okay to share my screen?
Sure, yeah.
So this is just an example of a good descriptive guide. This is from the Alberta Agriculture, but it does show, like typically when we talk about growth stages, we talk about the BBCH guide. So here it's starting from early stem elongation. And just like Lionel said, we're pulling apart the tillers, looking at the main, and then mainly looking at the growth stage of the main stem. So for guides like this, you would disregard the tillers and just look at the main stem after the tillering stage is completed. And yeah, I would just recommend looking at guides like this when you're looking at, fungicides, herbicides, maturity, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of all I have to say, but yeah, there's a lot of good guides out there. I just don't have one to pull up right now.
Okay, no, thanks, Anne. I said I wasn't able to find the best of pictures, but I agree with you what you said. You basically want to count the leaves on the main stem and not count the tillers. That's probably the key message, right?
Yeah, and since we're getting up to fungicide timing and people will be thinking about Fusarium head blight fungicides, fairly soon, it's just important to consider only the growth stage of the main head. So not to look at flowering in the tillers, but just to look at the main head.
Great, yeah, because that's when you want to base most of your application, right?
Yes, yeah, you'll be basing application based on the growth stage of the main stem.
Sounds good. Okay, so Lori, if you could give me the screen back. I'm not sure if we don't see any other questions on the panel right now. So I'm going to go through a few of the closing slides. Crop protection guides are still available. So not only is they talking about the different products that are available, there's also a lot of good information like we just talked about, staging, chemical makeup. We're getting into fungicides. Fungicides are in there. So again, those books are available at the local ag office. Seasonal reports, they're coming out weekly here. And again, a lot of real good information. So definitely go and check those out as well. The Farm Production Extension Specialists in Manitoba. Again, like I always mention, if you've got questions, feel free to call any one of these people. They can either give you the answer or find the answer out for you in a short period of time. And next Wednesday is July 1st, so we're going to be celebrating Canada Day, so there won't be a Crop Talk next Wednesday. So the next Crop Talk will be July the 8th. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd like to thank the panel, and we'll see you on July the 8th.